The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was sitting in my mailbox between a water bill and a grocery store flyer, like it was nothing, like it was just another piece of paper. But the moment I read the first line, my stomach dropped. You are hereby notified that your exterior-mounted surveillance cameras are in violation of Section 4.7 of the Maplewood Ridge Community Standards. You have 14 days to remove all units or face a daily fine of $150. I read it twice. Then I walked back inside and sat down at my kitchen table. My wife looked at me. She said, "What is it?" I put the letter down in front of her and watched her face change as she read it. Because here is what the HOA did not know. Here is what Sandra Kellner, the president of the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association, had no idea about when she drafted that letter and dropped it in the mail with a smile on her face. Those cameras had been running for 11 weeks, and in 11 weeks, a D recorded everything. My name is David Marsh, and I have lived in Maplewood Ridge for 9 years. My wife, Claire, and I moved in when our daughter was 2 years old. We were in our early 30s. We had just enough saved for the down payment. The house was small, a 3-bedroom colonial on the quiet end of Birchwood Lane, but we loved it from the first walk-through. Big backyard, mature oak trees, a neighborhood that still felt like neighbors actually knew each other. For the first 6 years it did. The HOA existed, but it existed quietly. There were dues. There were occasional reminders about keeping gutters clean or putting trash cans away by Monday evening. Nothing aggressive, nothing personal. The management company that ran it was low-key. The president at the time was a retired electrician named Gary Hollis, who genuinely could not have cared less what color you painted your shutters. He had bigger things on his mind, mostly fishing. Gary retired from the board in the spring of year 7. That is when Sandra Kellner ran for president. She ran unopposed. Only 22 of the 94 households even returned a ballot. Most people did not bother, including me. I figured it was a formality, someone to sign documents and show up at the annual meeting. I was wrong. Within 2 months of taking office, Sandra issued 41 violation notices across the neighborhood. 41. Gary had issued maybe a dozen in 4 years. Sandra did it in 60 days. A man 3 houses down got fined because his basketball hoop was 4 inches too close to the street. A retired schoolteacher got a violation for a wind chime that Sandra claimed was audibly disruptive to neighboring properties. A family with 3 young kids was told to remove a small inflatable pool from their own fenced backyard because it was aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. People were confused at first, then frustrated, then quietly furious. But nobody challenged her directly. Shh. E had the board behind her. She had the CC and RS. She had the fine structure and the legal authority to put a lien on your property if dues or fines went unpaid. So people paid. They complained to each other over fences and in driveways. And they paid. We went 18 months without a direct problem. I kept my lawn trimmed. I repainted the front door in a color I cleared with the board. I smiled when I saw Sandra at the mailbox. Then our car was stolen. It happened on a Thursday night in October. Claire's Honda Civic, gone from the driveway by morning. The police were helpful but honest. Without footage, the chances of recovery were low. Our street had no municipal cameras. None of the immediate neighbors had exterior cameras either. There was nothing to go on. We got the car back 3 weeks later, stripped. It was towed to a lot 40 miles away with no plates and the steering column pulled apart. The insurance covered most of it but not all of it, and more than the money, it shook some. Thing loose in me. I started researching camera systems that weekend. I am not someone who goes overboard on things. I am an accountant. I think in terms of reasonable precautions and cost-benefit decisions. But having something taken from my property in the middle of the night, in a neighborhood I trusted, changed my thinking. I bought a 4-camera system, 2 in front, 1 on each side of the house covering the driveway approach and the side gates. Professional installation, weatherproof housing, motion activated with night vision and a 30-day local storage loop backed up to cloud storage every 4 hours. The installer said to me, "You want these to be visible or discreet?" I said, "Visible. I want people to know they are there." He mounted them professionally. Clean brackets, no loose wiring showing, nothing that looked improvised. I thought they looked sharp, actually. Modern. If anything, I thought they made the house look more maintained. The cameras went live on a Friday. Afternoon in November. I did not think about Section 4.7. I did not think about Sandra Kellner. I should have known she would. She appeared at my front door 11 days after installation. I know the exact time frame because I checked the footage later. She knocked 3 times. I opened the door. She was standing there in her HOA polo shirt, the one she wore to every board meeting and apparently to every confrontation she engineered in between, holding a clipboard and smiling the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. She said, "Hi, David. Do you have a moment?" I said sure and stepped onto the porch. She did not beat around the bush. She looked up at the front-facing cameras, made a small performance of noticing them, and said, "I wanted to personally reach out before this becomes a formal matter. The cameras are not compliant under our current community guidelines." I asked her what guidelines. She flipped a page on her clipboard and quoted Section 4.7, Exterior Mounted Surveillance. Equipment requires prior written approval from the board and must meet specific placement and visibility criteria. She said mine did not meet the criteria. I asked what the criteria were. She said the board would provide written clarification. I said, "So you do not have the criteria on you right now?" Something flickered across her face. She said the written notice would follow. I said, "Okay. When it arrives, I will review it." She was not expecting that. I think she expected me to start apologizing or to immediately say I would take the cameras down. Instead, I just smiled and said I looked forward to seeing the written documentation. She left. She was polite, but something about the way she walked back to her car told me that conversation had not gone the way she planned. The formal letter arrived 4 days later. 14 days to remove. $150 per day after that. I sat with it for a full afternoon before I decided what to do. Here is the part of this story. I have never told anyone outside my immediate family, because I never had to. When Sandra's letter arrived, something about the phrasing bothered me. The cameras were in violation and needed to come down. Not, "We need to discuss your placement." Not, "Here is an application process for approval." Down, immediately. No discussion. That felt personal. And when something feels personal, I start asking why. So I went back through 11 weeks of footage. I was not looking for anything specific. I just wanted to understand the timeline. When did Sandra first notice the cameras? What happened around that time? What I found took me 4 hours to get through. I sat in my home office with a yellow legal pad taking notes, and by the time I finished I had 3 pages of notes and a very different understanding of what was happening in this neighborhood. I am going to walk you through what was on those recordings, because this is the part where everything changes. Week 1. Nothing unusual. Cars pass. Sing. Deliveries. My daughter getting on the school bus. Normal neighborhood activity. Week 2. Tuesday afternoon. Sandra Kellner's silver SUV pulls slowly past my house. She slows almost to a stop in front of the camera, looks directly at it, drives on. I checked the timestamp. This was 5 days before she came to my door. Week 3. This is where it gets interesting. The side gate camera facing the shared easement between my property and my neighbor Ron Baxter's property captures Sandra entering the easement on foot at 7:14 in the morning. She is carrying something. The resolution is clear. She walks the length of the easement, stops at the rear corner of my property, and takes photographs. She was photographing my backyard, on my side of the easement, without my permission, without any notice, without any posted purpose. I kept watching. Week 4. Ron Baxter, my next-door neighbor, knocks on Sandra's front door. They have a 10-minute conversation on her porch. The front camera has a partial sightline to her driveway. I cannot hear the audio from that distance, but I can see body language clearly. Ron is talking with his hands. Sandra is nodding. At one point, she puts a hand on his arm. I noted the date. Week 5. A truck from a local landscaping company parks in front of my house for 20 minutes. The driver walks around the perimeter of my property with what looks like a measuring tape or surveying tool. He does not knock on my door. He does not have a visible permit or authorization. He leaves. I log the truck's license plate from the footage. Week 6. Ron Baxter receives a violation notice in his mailbox. I can see it from my front camera. Green envelope, the HOA's signature format. I watch him open it. Watch his face. He goes inside. 2 days later, his violation is gone from the HOA's public enforcement log. I know because I checked. I had started checking the log weekly by this point. Ron never got fined for whatever was in that notice. And then understood. Sandra was using the violation process as leverage. Issue a notice, apply pressure, get what she needed from a neighbor, make the notice disappear. Ron had told her something about me, about my property, about the cameras, and whatever he told her was enough to make her want those cameras gone immediately. I kept going. Week 8, my daughter's basketball hoop in the driveway. It had been there for 2 years without a single mention. Sandra drives past, slows down, takes a photograph from her car window. 3 days later, I receive a separate minor violation notice about the hoop's placement. 2 violations running simultaneously, both from the same woman, both targeting the same property. I looked at every single neighbor's violation history in the HOA log, public record, accessible to all residents. In the past year, Sandra had issued citations to 6 properties on my street. 4 of those 6 homeowners had recently declined something she had proposed at a board meeting, and I had declined her informal push to join a neighborhood watch subcommittee she was forming, which would have given her access to a shared camera network across the street. I finally understood why she wanted my cameras gone. They were not an HOA problem. They were her problem. I did not respond to the violation letter immediately. I gave it a week. I let the deadline approach. And in that week, I did 4 things. First, I pulled every piece of the CC&RS I could find and read Section 4.7 in its entirety. The section was vague. It mentioned prior board approval and placement criteria, but it did not specifically prohibit cameras. It did not define what the approval process entailed. It had not been formally updated since 2019. Second, I submitted a formal written request to the board for the specific criteria my cameras failed to meet. I sent it certified mail with a return receipt. I gave them 7 days to respond. I kept a copy of everything. Third, I pulled the footage of Sandra O. in the easement and had it time-stamped and backed up to a secondary cloud account. I noted every clip relevant to what I had found and organized them by date with written descriptions. Fourth, I called my cousin. My cousin Marcus is not a dramatic person. He is very quiet, very methodical, and he has been a real estate attorney in this state for 14 years. He specializes in HOA law. I had not spoken to him about any of this because honestly, for most of the year I had not thought it was serious enough. I called him on a Thursday evening. I talked for 45 minutes. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "David, do you still have all of this footage?" I said yes, every second of it. He said, "Don't touch the cameras, don't take them down, and don't pay the fine." He told me to get him copies of everything by Monday. The monthly board meeting fell 2 weeks after Sandra's deadline expired. I had not taken the cameras down. I had not paid the fine. I had submitted my written request for criteria clarification and received, in response, a letter that restated the violation without answering my question. I submitted a formal request to be heard at the meeting. Homeowners had the right to address the board during a public comment period. Sandra, as president, had to acknowledge the request. She acknowledged it. I showed up early and sat in the second row of folding chairs in the community room. There were maybe 30 people there, which was unusual. The average meeting had 8, but word had gotten around that something was happening with David Marsh and the cameras. People came out. Sandra called the meeting to order and moved through the agenda with the efficiency of someone who was used to controlling the room. She saved my item for last. When she called my name, I walked to the front with a manila folder and a USB drive. I said, "Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to address the outstanding violation notice regarding my exterior cameras. I have submitted a written request for the specific compliance criteria my installation fails to meet. As of tonight, I have not received a substantive answer. I would like that answer tonight, on the record." Sandra said the criteria were clearly stated in Section 4.7. I said, "With respect, Section 4.7 requires prior written approval and references placement criteria, but does not define those criteria. I am asking for the specific written documented criteria used to determine my installation is non-compliant." The board member to Sandra's right shifted in his seat. Sandra said the board had discretion to evaluate compliance on a case-by-case basis. I said, "Okay, then I would like to ask a few questions about how that discretion is applied." I opened my folder. I had printed out a chart. 11 properties in Maplewood Ridge with visible exterior cameras. I had verified each one personally. walking the public streets, 11 properties. Mine was the only one with an Acti V violation notice. I read the addresses out loud. The room was very quiet. Sandra said every case was evaluated individually. I said, of course, and I respect that. But I want to make sure I understand the process. Is there documentation showing the evaluation that was conducted for each of these properties? She said the board's deliberations were internal. I said, that is fine. I want to ask about something else then. I pulled out the second sheet. It was a printed still from my side gate camera footage. Sandra on the easement. Date and timestamp in the corner. Clear, high-resolution image. I held it up so the room could see it. I said, this is from my camera. The camera the board wants removed. It shows someone entering the shared easement along my property line and photographing my backyard without notice or consent. The timestamp shows this occurred 6 days before I received Sandra's personal visit and 11 days before I received the formal violation letter. The room erupts. Ted, not loudly. The eruption of a room that does not shout is somehow more unsettling than one that does. It was the sound of people turning to each other, chairs shifting, 30 people recalibrating what they thought they knew. Sandra said, that is a mischaracterization of a routine property inspection. I said, routine property inspections require notice. State law, Section 720.304. I never received notice. Marcus had told me that statute number. I had practiced saying it 3 times in the car on the way over. One of the board members asked Sandra directly if she had issued proper notice before conducting an inspection of my property. Sandra said the rules allowed the association to access common areas and easements. The board member said that was not what she had asked. The meeting adjourned without a vote on my violation. Sandra tabled it, which she had the authority to do. She said the matter required further review, but the meeting had been recorded. Every HOA meeting was recorded by board policy, and 30 people had been in that room. By the following Monday, 2 things happened. The first, Marcus filed a formal demand letter to the HOA board on my behalf. It outlined the procedural deficiencies in the violation process, cited the unauthorized property access, referenced the inconsistent enforcement record across the community, and requested the immediate removal of all outstanding fines and violations against my property. It gave them 21 days to respond in writing. The second, 4 neighbors called me, not to complain, not to vent. They called to tell me they had similar stories. One woman had been fined for a garden ornament after she voted against Sandra's proposal at a board meeting. A retired firefighter 3 streets over had received 2 violations in a month after asking publicly why the HOA's annual financial statement had not been published on time. They asked if they could talk to Marcus. He said yes. Within 30 days, the HOASM management company had been notified of the collective complaints. Within 45 days, the board had voted 4-1 to place Sandra on administrative leave pending a review. The dissenting vote was Sandra's own. Within 60 days, the outstanding violation against my cameras had been formally dismissed. The cameras stayed up. Here is something I want to say directly. I am not the kind of person who wanted any of this to become a public event. I am not someone who enjoys conflict. I am an accountant who lives on a quiet street and likes grilling on weekends and watching his daughter play in the backyard. What I am is someone who pays attention to details, someone who keeps records. Someone who, when something does not feel right, does not dismiss that feeling but follows it methodically until he understands what is actually happening. Sandra Kellner was not a cartoon villain. She was a person who had been given a small amount of power and had slowly, over time, convinced herself that power existed to serve her own purposes. That is not rare. It is actually very common, and the only thing that stops it is documentation. The cameras I installed were not installed because I suspected Sandra. I installed them because my wife's car was stolen. That is all. But they were running, and they recorded what happened. And because they were recording, I had evidence instead of just feelings. The board's formal review found that Sandra had, on 4 documented occasions, entered private property or easements without the required advance notice. It found that at least 3 violation notices issued in the past year contained insufficient procedural basis. It found that 1 notice had been informally withdrawn in exchange for cooperation from a neighbor, which violated the association's own conflict of interest policy. She resigned before the review was completed. The new board sent a letter to all 94 households. It acknowledged that enforcement practices had been inconsistent and announced a 30-day suspension of all pending violations pending a comprehensive review. My neighbor, the woman with the wind chime, got a check in the mail for the fines she had paid. 9 years in this neighborhood. I have watched it change. I have watched seasons pass and families move in and children grow and houses get new roofs and old trees come down. This neighborhood, imperfect as it was ours. What I learned from this experience is not that HOAs are inherently corrupt or that power always gets abused. Most people, given authority, try to use it reasonably. But the ones who do not are counting on something very specific. They are counting on you not having proof. They are counting on it being your word against theirs in a room where they hold the clipboard and you are just a homeowner. They are counting on exhaustion, on people calculating the cost of a fight against the energy it requires, and quietly paying the fine and walking away. The cameras were not a weapon. They were a record, a simple, factual, time-stamped record of what actually happened. And when the moment came where someone in power looked me in the eye and described a version of reality that was not true, I did not have to argue with her. I just had to show the footage. Whatever is happening in your neighborhood, whatever pressure is being applied to you, whatever authority is being exercised in ways that feel wrong, document it. Write it down, date it, save it. You may never need it, but if you do, you will be very grateful you have it.